From DLA Piper, this is the Beyond the Curve podcast. In this episode, DLA Piper's Kristy Balsanek and Holly Lake are joined by Deloitte's Christina Brodzik to discuss the importance of diversity and diversity initiatives in a company's overall ESG framework.
Hello and welcome to Beyond the Curve. My name is Holly Lake and I'm a partner at DLA Piper based in Los Angeles. I'm joined today by Kristy Balsanek, a partner at DLA Piper, as well as Christina Brodzik from Deloitte. Today we will be talking about ESG and in particular the S pillar as it relates to diversity and diversity initiatives. ESG is a relatively new practice area and ESG practitioners come from various backgrounds. So before we take a deeper dive, Kristy, can you tell us a bit about what you do now at DLA Piper and your unique background that informs you on an ESG practice?
Certainly. And thank you, Holly and Christina. It's so great to be with you both today on this important topic. My name is Kristy Balsanek, and I'm a partner in the DC office of DLA Piper in the Regulatory and Government Affairs practice. And I'm global co-chair for DLA's ESG practice group. I recently was a general counsel in-house at North America divisions for two companies, both headquartered in Europe, and was overseeing legal and compliance and was very focused, of course, on ESG because since both companies were headquartered in Europe and Europe's being a bit further ahead than the US on these topics, this is something that I had great oversight on and focus. So came over to DLA to help look at this from a broad perspective of the environmental side, the social side, the governance side, to really take that holistic approach for our clients.
Thanks, Kristy. Christina, you're at Deloitte. Can you tell us about your unique background that informs you on the ESG practice?
Sure. So I am a principal in our consulting business, and I lead Deloitte's enterprise-wide diversity, equity, and inclusion services to our clients. I've been at Deloitte for the last 18 years.
Thanks, Christina. And I'm Holly Lake. I'm a partner at DLA Piper, and I am based in the Los Angeles office. I practice employment law and employment litigation. And I have come to this ESG practice by virtue of the totality of my practice in the employment arena and how it is part of the broader conversation of ESG now, that we look at diversity initiatives, diversity metrics, things like incumbency analysis, and we see how it impacts not only defining a workforce, but also potential litigation. For those who are new to this area, what is ESG and why is diversity in particular so important to this S pillar? Kristy, you want to start?
Sure. Thank you, Holly. And yes, ESG is new to a lot of people who may be listening to this podcast, or it's something people may have heard of and would like to understand it better because it is quite broad. But essentially what ESG is, it's an overarching framework for identifying and managing a company's environmental and social risk factors and the impact they have on global communities, with a view towards creating a long-term value and sustainability for those companies. And this really has grown out of this increase in expectation and pressure from a variety of stakeholders, including investors and regulators, customers, employees, and communities, with that increasing expectation of transparency and really wanting to have more of a meaningful contribution and impact to enhance the sustainability and value of companies. And this is across the environmental social governance space. And it's really looking so that companies integrate ESG into their business strategy and their longer term investments. And actually, as of even yesterday, the Wall Street Journal reported that about 70% of U.S. companies, CEOs, have said that companies' ESG programs have actually improved their company's financial performance. So there's a real focus on that, human capital management, business and human rights. But really that diversity piece that Holly mentioned is a critical piece to that. So I'd love to hear more about what you see in terms of the diversity focus that has been so much a part of the ESG discussion.
So from my perspective, this is so important because the S pillar and diversity in particular impacts a wide range of stakeholders, not only an entity's employees or potential employees, but consumers, investors, governmental agencies. It is really 360, whereas many of the other pillars may have more specific or defined stakeholders. Diversity and the impact of diversity and diversity initiatives really impacts everyone, quite frankly, that touches the company or that has interest in the company. And it really changes the shape of a company's internally and externally and their brand. So from my perspective, diversity is important in this ESG discussion because of what you can do as a threshold. Obviously, your compliance factors that are important, the steps that you take that are necessary, preliminary, but also the impact that happens thereafter.
And Christina, what about you? What do you see on terms of diversity and this focus on the ESG?
So I would agree with what Holly said, that there's so many different stakeholders when you're looking within the S of ESG. And we're starting to see that those groups are becoming more and more diverse themselves. So it's really critical to an organization's success to care about diversity and diversity initiatives. And we have found, and I think you mentioned some of this, that companies that do this well, that lean into it, they'll have more success across critical business levers like access to talent, brand sentiment, access to capital, better sales and revenue, better operational efficiency, and better ability to mitigate risk.
And given this sort of overlay that we had in terms of an introduction on ESG, Christina, from your perspective at Deloitte, what are you seeing right now to be those really critical focus areas that companies have at this juncture?
From a diversity perspective, I would say something that we're seeing a lot of is that there were organizations that made DEI commitments in summer of 2020, public commitments. And I think many of them thought 5 years, we're going to make great progress. So a lot of them said that they'd be seeing results by 2025. And then some of them have gone silent. So one of the things that we're seeing right now in this space is people making good on those commitments. So that's a big trend that we're seeing right now. So every month that those are delayed is more time for an organization to improve their outcomes so that what they report is actually more favorable. So giving them time to do some preliminary internal reporting, see where they have some holes or opportunities to do better, and then fixing it in advance of more public formal reporting.
How do you see companies approaching that right now as they try to gather that information?
So one way I'm seeing it is just them putting those controls in place to be able to gather it and to make sure that the information is correct. Another thing that we're seeing is that many organizations haven't really adjusted how they collect some of this diversity information in many, many years. So for example, 20 years ago, and we have plenty of employees that have been working at organizations for 20 years. 20 years ago, it was okay for a recruiter to just guess somebody's identities and just put them down. That was fine. And if you were doing ESG reporting today based off of some of that information, you'd likely be underreporting on the diversity within your organization. So one of the trends that we're seeing is organizations really getting serious and specific about self-ID campaigns, giving employees the opportunity to self-identify so that they are represented the way that they feel they should be. And we're seeing that that is helping organizations feel more confident in the data that they're gathering and eventually the reporting that they'll be able to do. And they're finding that they probably, while there's a lot of work to be done, have more diversity in their organization than they originally thought when they were perhaps doing another method of gathering the information.
But companies are still finding that employees or applicants, quite frankly, as well, are resistant to self-identify, and they are voluntarily electing not to self-identify. So companies still need to recognize that they can do a visual ID for those people that do elect not to self-identify.
And Holly, from your side, what do you see as some of the other more critical focus areas right now in your space?
One of the critical things is succession planning. Succession planning at all levels, the executive level, the board level, et cetera. We have to make sure that companies are putting a plan in place to transition and get ready for the future. So it's not only developing strategies for recruitment, for capturing the data, for accurately capturing the data, for understanding your population, but making sure your population and your workforce is prepared for the future.
So what are the goals of the company overall, not only within its own employees and management, but thinking about who they want to partner with going forward? And that can across any type of company, whether it's in a particular sector or industry, but really thinking about how to look and onboard new business partners and what that may be for their own goals to make sure they're not misaligned once they get started. So there's the pre-diligence piece and thinking about how you gather that data and the analytics there, but then trying to manage that too going forward. And I was curious what you're seeing a little further in terms of that type of analysis for supply chain and just how companies perhaps can think about that.
One thing I've been seeing is a view towards brand alignment. So it's not just making sure that companies are contracting with or working with entities that say they are diverse or say diversity is important to them, but making sure that the relationships that they are entering into are with companies that are truly acting upon or representing themselves to the market in a way that is consistent with their own brand.
And I would just add to thinking just broadly as well for companies, those that may be in a M&A position where they're looking to merge or acquire other companies. And again, sort of how that diversity and ESG topic should be looked at in terms of due diligence and looking at companies and understanding a little further about what's going on at those companies on these topics, as well as then the post-integration piece with companies coming on board after acquisition and how they can integrate themselves, that potentially there could be two very different work cultures that would have to then align and come together in a way that is something that can be focused on too. And was curious what your thoughts were in that context. Christina, I'm sure Deloitte's had a lot of work on those topics.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I couldn't agree more. I think we're seeing more and more focus on diversity and diversity initiatives as we look at M&A and the due diligence process. I mean, are companies that we may be looking to acquire, do they even have their data ready? To your point, do they have their values aligned? Might there be any skeletons in the closet that would hurt value if you bring it on? Those are things that we're increasingly seeing people look at when they're looking into deals. And then afterwards, there's such a great opportunity during integration to take the leading practice or the things that are working best from either organization and use that as the new normal. So there's a really great opportunity there, but there is a little bit of risk too. So it's best to go into it with eyes wide open.
Holly, what about your thoughts on that? And particularly, I always think about, too, just with training and raising awareness on these topics about bringing different workforces together.
I think communication is key. Some may say there's not a lot of value or they haven't seen a lot of tangible value in training. But if you think about training more in terms of making sure that all parties involved are communicating about values, about priorities, about intent. When you see two companies come together, you especially have to make sure that recruitment is aligned and how they want to go about recruiting new employees, relationships they may have with entities that help them recruit. Again, I can't underscore the importance of communication. So, Kristy, are there currently ESG reporting disclosure requirements for diversity topics to enhance corporate transparency?
I'd love to talk about the diversity reporting and disclosure piece. It's a really important question, Holly. And just from my side, just to give some context that right now, currently, there's no affirmative obligation in the United States to disclose on ESG as a whole, right? Right now, of course, we've got stakeholders that are expecting this from companies really on a voluntary basis is what's happening for reporting, because our stakeholders are really looking to evaluate companies' ESG programs to determine what those strategies look like. So the concern, and as Christina too mentioned, when companies are voluntarily reporting, that those disclosure statements and commitments, at least for a lot of the public companies, because public companies, of course, are subject to the U.S. SEC, the securities laws for false and misleading claims. Do what you say what you mean. There could be, of course, risks around disclosures for federal and state consumer protection laws. We've seen class actions, state AG lawsuits, investor claims. So those disclosure statements really are very critical right now, even if there isn't the mandatory disclosure. And having said that, though, what the SEC has done in terms of the human capital management, back in 2021, the SEC is requiring public companies to disclose their human capital, their resources, measures, and objectives that they use to manage their business. However, with that, the SEC has not specified what those metrics are. So right now, companies are deciding what is material to their operations. So a lot of what's been disclosed in at least the public company side relates to a lot of different topics. And those could range from numbers of employees, their geographic locations, full-time, part-time, retirement, welfare benefits, talent development, and so on. But really, companies ultimately are only choosing maybe 3 or 4 of those types of topics to report upon. Right now, though, we're looking at whether the SEC may actually issue a mandatory disclosure. It's a potentially proposed new rule that potentially could come out, which would enhance these types of human capital management metrics. And that would be a more detailed and standardized grid approach that would get into the details of workforce investment. And it potentially could include salary details, bonuses, employee turnover, healthcare pensions, and other things that would then increase the opportunity for investors to have an increasing insight into diversity. So it's something that we're monitoring on the US side. On the EU side, we mentioned earlier that the EU is a lot further ahead than the US on these disclosure requirements. So right now in the EU, there is a new corporate sustainability, it's a reporting directive that came in effect on January 5th of this year, 2023. And that is one that even those companies sitting in the US, there may actually be in-scope impact for US companies that in the future may have to disclose on various environmental and social factors. And on the social side, that could include diversity and inclusion information. There's a phase-in approach for the companies that would have to report, and it really depends on the number of employees you have, the revenue, and whether for U.S. companies there's some type of EU business operation. So it's really something that companies can take a look at to see if they are in scope. But this would be this type of reporting directive that would include not only providing metrics on these social factors, but inclusive of business strategy, business models, and that wouldn't be inclusive to going down the value chain that we were speaking about earlier. So it's something that we're really keeping an eye on from this side. And Christina, I know Deloitte does a lot of work in this space too, so it would be helpful to hear too what you're seeing.
So I would definitely agree with what you're saying. What's out there isn't really very robust, and it's not mandated here. So what I see today is metrics that get more at representation versus actual outcomes. And what we see is mostly related to gender at the leadership levels. Maybe some go to age, disability, and ethnicity, but very rarely. And we're seeing some that are related to supply chain in the marketplace. We're seeing very few metrics out there that focus on products and services or marketing or sales or customers. And one of the things that we did is we took a look at what was out there and where did we see anything related to DEI in there and where did we not. So standards that we saw that did have some DEI related metrics were the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, so SASB, UN Sustainable Development Goals, also referred to as SDGs, CDP, so formerly known as Climate Disclosure Project, the EU Sustainability Reporting Standards that you mentioned, and the Global Reporting Initiative. And ones where we didn't see any diversity-related metrics were International Sustainability Standards Board, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. So I think you can look to those that do have some diversity-related metrics for inspiration of what's coming in the future.
Those are really important pieces of information, and particularly for companies who may be just looking to see what type of frameworks they may consider if they decide to go forward with type of a reporting, since it's still not mandatory in the US, but we're looking to see on the European side. And I think an important point to that too is that a lot of companies may think that this only applies to public companies, but the reality is as the publics are being asked to disclose and that enhancement of transparency, they're also pushing that down and asking their own value chain that we mentioned earlier that may include private companies to also look at what type of social strategy, ESG strategy, diversity strategy, and requesting them to also come into the alignment of values that the public company or others may have. So it's something that really can cross over to a variety of different businesses. And Holly, when you hear about the type of potential disclosures and reporting that may be coming. From your perspective, what are your thoughts in terms of thinking about that for clients?
Well, it's interesting because all data can be used against an entity, against a company. And of course, I think that will eventually happen in the litigation space. And that takes us to the place where I think it's very important for companies to define who they want to be, where they want to be, and what risk they want to take. Yes, there will be some mandated reporting, but you have to take stock of how you're going to report, how you're going to internally define that will impact what you are reporting.
I think companies are really going to have to make sure that they're not operating in silos, that they don't have different business teams just deciding on their own to make statements, whether it's on the website or other types of reporting that they do, and even internal employee communications, who's drafting those, and just making sure that's aligned across the business so that those statements are accurate and they're verified and consistent.
Well, Kristy, that's imperative. And I mean, that goes to really what companies should be thinking about as they navigate their way along this ESG journey. They really do need to be defining themselves, ensuring there's some consistency across the organization in terms of that definition, and making sure there's cohesion. ESG obviously involves so much and so many different disciplines, but there needs to be some way where it's filtered through one source, whoever that might be, and it should be, quite frankly, the boards, to make sure that each company knows who they want to be, they know how they want to define themselves, they know the communications they want to make, they know the representations they want to make, they know where they want to be in terms of threshold compliance versus more robust engagement, and they are consistent and accurate.
You bring up a good point, Holly, because a lot of companies are really advanced in this space, and they've been doing this for many years, so have been thinking about this very critically. And we have a lot of other clients and companies that really are just starting out because they just haven't been a focus of that. Maybe they have different types of stakeholders or different legal requirements. But Christina, can you share a little bit about how you see companies can best navigate wherever they are in their journey, given this just really rapidly changing landscape?
For sure. I think about starting at the beginning. If we were talking to a company that was just starting the journey, I would say start by making ESG somebody's role and focus. So too many times I see it as somebody's night job. The journey is going to be really hard and slow if no one's held accountable or on point for bringing the right people together in all the ways that you both just mentioned. I also think that person can get started, or that team can get started, understanding what regulations apply to your organization depending on where in the world you operate, both right now and then potentially in the future. And then getting prepared and making sure that you have the right controls in place to be able to accurately report. Once those basic things are done, I think we could see organizations gathering all the stakeholders within that can influence their ESG journey so that they can start to set stretch goals beyond just compliance and reporting, and aligning on the main levers that they're willing to pull to get there. So not every idea is going to be one that everybody's willing to do. So what are you willing to do to get there?
Christina, I just wanted to underscore something else you just said. You said make sure that you have someone who is owning the responsibility for ESG. I think it's also important that that person is respected and empowered and has the appropriate ear, so that it's not just someone who has the title, but there is defined importance within the organization of that role and what that person is doing.
Completely agree.
Agreed as well. And I think you both bring up the very good point, because this is such a new space that there's actually a real need for sustainability and ESG experience by employees and companies that can hire team members who just know about this space and can bring in that expertise. And because for so many companies, this is very new and they're trying to build out these teams, sometimes all of this work could be given just to someone within the HR department or the legal compliance or a procurement department. And suddenly that individual is now given this entire responsibility on top of their other responsibilities. And so how does that work? So to completely agree and thinking about, and that's on the governance side, is just what the committees that may be needed cross-functionally across business teams, and just how you have that accountability and ownership so that they are really talking to each other to ensure that those commitments are truly the ones the company can stand behind. And Christina, also I'll highlight too, in terms of starting out, especially with some of these changes that we may see on the legal landscape, with us really looking to see what may be in scope in terms of those new laws and taking that materiality assessment with respect to stakeholders and the risks and legal landscape that companies may face, and thinking about what gap analysis there could be, and looking at peers benchmarking against other companies and looking on the horizon to see what could be coming around in terms of some of these new laws, and really putting that action plan in place with the policy and procedures that perhaps some companies may have some policies and procedures in place, but really making sure it's integrated across their business teams. And then to that accountability in terms of tracking that progress. So I think all of that together can really enhance those ESG programs and strategy for companies as they try and navigate this. I know this is a broad topic, but this has been such an interesting discussion, and I've really enjoyed hearing both of your insights in the ESG space and with a particular focus on diversity, and appreciate all your thought leadership and really appreciate the time. So thank you, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for listening to DLA Piper's Beyond the Curve podcast. All information, content, and materials contained in this podcast are for general informational purposes only. This podcast is intended to be a general overview of the subjects discussed and does not create a lawyer-client relationship. Statements and opinions are those of the individual speakers and participants and do not necessarily reflect the policies or opinions of DLA Piper LLP US. The information contained in this podcast is not and should not be used as a substitute for legal advice. No listener should act or refrain from acting with respect to any particular legal matter on the basis of this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel in the relevant jurisdiction. This podcast may qualify as lawyer advertising, requiring notice in some jurisdictions. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. DLA Piper LLP US accepts no responsibility for any actions taken or not taken as a result of this podcast.